On today's show, the Houston Rockets and Fred VanVleet mutually agree to push back the deadline for his contract's team option for next season. Why this is a good thing for both sides, what it looks like if the Rockets elect to pick up the team option, and what it looks like if they decline the team option. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code Locked On NBA for $20 off of your first purchase. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. If you missed it, we mentioned it on a previous episode that the Rockets had a lot of different things that they were going to have to tackle this offseason, but the most pressing issue was going to be the team option on Fred VanVleet's contract for next season. And the trigger date on that contract was going to be 5 days after the postseason ended, which is not conventional whatsoever. Usually, most player options, team options, have an exercise date at the end of June, so that teams have plenty of time after the season, after the playoffs, everything to kind of put their thoughts together. They can figure things out at the NBA draft, all these different elements right before free agency. And that was going to be an issue for the Rockets and Fred VanVleet. But per Shams Charania, the Houston Rockets and Fred VanVleet are pushing back Friday's deadline date to June 29th on his $44.9 million team option for the 2025-2026 season. And this is great news. This is great news for both sides, for the Rockets and for Fred VanVleet, because it just allows both sides to work together and to have more time to figure out what the next steps are moving forward, whether that is picking up the option and what that potentially looks like for Fred VanVleet and his future, whether that's declining the option and then, either both sides going separate ways, or the very likely outcome of renegotiating a newer contract on a much friendlier team deal. And we're going to kind of navigate through these different options here in just a moment, but it's worth noting, right? If you're in the camp of, if you're part of the anti-FVV brigade, which is wild that there's an anti-FVV conglomerate amongst Rockets fans, given how important he's been to the fabric of this team and how beneficial it's been to have him out there on the floor. All signs are very much pointing towards the fact that Fred VanVleet will likely be a Rocket for a very, very long time. You go back to the press conference with Ime Udoka in the immediate aftermath of Game 7. Udoka was asked about Fred VanVleet's future there. Fred VanVleet was asked about his future. Rafael Stone was asked about Fred VanVleet's contract status and future at the end of season press conference. And I'm paraphrasing here, but all of the replies were basically we like each other. We want to stick together. Fred going so far as to say that when he had his free agency pitch with the Rockets 2 years ago, that the vision was never going to be a short-term kind of thing. And while Fred VanVleet was brought in to kind of usher in the new age, and I've used the term training wheels and things like that for Fred VanVleet, it doesn't mean that he can't still be a part of this team's success as they start to navigate into this next era of high-level competitive Rockets basketball, where they obviously just finished as the 2 seed in the Western Conference and, have high hopes to come back next season even better, whether that's with continuity and internal growth or making major moves this offseason. Fred VanVleet can absolutely still be a part of that going forward. He is a winning player. He understands what it takes to win. He's a great extension of Ime Udoka on the floor. And for all these reasons, I would honestly be shocked if Fred VanVleet wasn't in a Rockets jersey next season. It's more so just about figuring out the logistics of all of it and understanding, okay, well, how do we navigate these next coming days and whatnot? And the issue here is, and I understand a lot of Rockets fans are very eager to see what Reed Sheppard has, what he's capable of. A lot of Rockets fans really believe that this team would be far and away better if you just gave the basketball over to Jalen Green and Amin Thompson and brought Fred VanVleet off the bench. And I understand that sentiment to an extent, but that's how you get a team that is going to choke away leads, is going to botch a bunch of possessions. And not to say that triumvirate of players, Jalen, Amin, and Fred, couldn't probably cobble together something that looks like a decent enough looking, kind of group of ball handlers to be able to keep the Rockets afloat, in certain situations. And again, we saw that happen when Fred got injured this past season, right? Jalen and Amin having to step up as primary ball handlers and relying on some Aaron Holiday minutes here and there and that kind of stuff. So I understand the sentiment of wanting to, I guess, clear some runway for more of the younger guys. But you also have to keep in mind, this Rockets team wants to win games. They want to win games right now at this very moment. And there's still going to be plenty of room for opportunity for example, for Reed Sheppard to play that backup point guard role this next season. In fact, the Rockets tried to give him the backup point guard role this season, and he just really wasn't ready for it. So that spot will very much still be there next season. The Rockets are internally very high on Reed Sheppard, and you would have to imagine that, assuming the Rockets are able to work something out with Fred VanVleet and bring him back for next year and for the foreseeable future, depending on what a potentially new contract would look like, or again, just picking up the option for next year to keep their options open, then there'll still be minutes for Reed to be able to, get 10, 15, 20 minutes a night and kind of develop into that role to hopefully, knock on wood, somewhere down the line, kind of, eventually take over the reins from Fred VanVleet as the team's starting point guard, assuming that Reed Sheppard develops and pans out the way that you would hope he does as a point guard prospect. And again, we've seen some great flashes from Reed Sheppard, and who better than to learn from than Fred VanVleet, right? When you look at the style of play, the skill set that Reed Sheppard has, Fred VanVleet is a great guy to try and emulate a lot of how he plays and what he brings to the table from that point guard position. So I like the idea of the Rockets trying to keep Fred VanVleet long-term. It's more about just figuring out the logistics and trying to understand how it ultimately all comes together. But by pushing back the contract trigger date, the Rockets have more time to work on that deal. In fact, they've got now a lot of alignment, because now the Rockets have until June 29th to make decisions on 4 different guys. So Fred VanVleet, and then Jock Landale with his $8 million non-guaranteed deal, Aaron Holiday with his $4.9 million team option, and then Nate Williams with his $2.3 million. I don't know if it's a team option or a non-guaranteed year for Nate Williams, but they've got 4 different guys that they have to make decisions on, but they don't have to make those decisions until June 29th. Now, we'll likely see news on Fred VanVleet's contract well ahead of June 29th, but coming up, I do want to talk about what each possible pathway looks like for the Houston Rockets. What does it look like if they just pick up his contract option and say yes to the $44.9 million deal or, year next season? And what does it look like if they decline his option and what that means for him going forward? We're going to talk about that in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Upwork. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. With Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more. Experts ready to help take your business to the next level. Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. If you need help with a marketing campaign, Upwork can connect you with a freelance expert who delivers incredible results. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's Upwork.com, UPWORK.com, Upwork.com to connect with top talent and grow your business today. Today's episode is also brought to you by Game Time. Look, there's nothing like the atmosphere of an NBA playoff game. Every bucket, every defensive stop, every moment feels absolutely huge. It's electric in the arena. It was awesome being at Toyota Center during the Rockets' first round series. And with Game Time, you can be a part of it without the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Game Time makes it fast and easy to get playoff tickets, even when demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down as tip-off gets closer, and their last-minute deals can save you up to 60%. My personal favorite thing about Game Time is they are fully transparent. The all-in pricing means no surprise fees at checkout. What you see is what you pay. Plus, the last-minute deals are just absolutely killer. Save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy events, theater stuff, whatever's happening near you. Game Time is where you want to get your tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying your tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so I'm going to start with what I think is the least likely outcome for the Rockets with Fred VanVleet's contract. And, you know, if you don't care about the least likely outcome, if you don't want to don your tinfoil hat with me for a minute, then just skip to this third segment. But if gigantic, like 72-point font, bold-faced if the Rockets elect to just pick up Fred VanVleet's contract, there is seemingly really only one reason that the Rockets would do that. Maybe two reasons. And it's pretty clearly the only reason the Rockets would say yes to accepting Fred's $44.9 million team option is that they have some kind of a big trade lined up this offseason. So come June 29th, if we get word that the Rockets, if the report surfaces, if the Shams tweet hits, and we see that the Rockets have elected to pick up the option for Fred VanVleet, you should be like, hunker down, get ready, press F5 constantly on your computer, scroll down, refresh your phone, stay glued, because that likely means the Rockets have some kind of a deal in place utilizing Fred's basically $45 million contract as a kind of salary ballast to make some kind of a substantial, likely star level move to bring in some top tier talent to help the Rockets. Because here's the rub, right? If the Rockets elect to make some kind of a substantial trade this offseason, they only have a handful of sizable salaries that would need to be included in some kind of a, we'll say, a Kevin Durant trade or a Giannis Antetokounmpo trade or a Devin Booker trade or any of these kind of trades that you see being thrown around with the idea that the Rockets can get their hands on a star level talent. All of these players make bank. You need to be able to match their salaries. And as far as the Rockets payroll is concerned, Fred VanVleet is he is the highest paid player on the roster. But if the Rockets were to accept, opt into or I guess pick up the option, it's not opting in if it's not a player option. But if they pick up that option, that gives them a really big salary to be able to move in any potential star level trade without having to part with one of Jalen Green or Alperen Sengun. Because when you look at the salaries for next year's Houston Rockets, Fred's salary clocking in at just under $45 million. Then you have Jalen Green making $33.3 million. You have Alperen Sengun making $33.9 million. Those are your next two highest paid players. And then you have Dillon Brooks making $21 million. After that, your next highest paid guys would be Jock Landale Reed Shepherd at $10.6 million, and then Jock Landale at $8 million. You also have mixed in there Jabari Smith Jr. at $12.3 million. And then that's it, right? And then the next few guys are, Tari's all the way down at 5.6. Aaron Holiday's down at 4.9. So for the Rockets to be able to facilitate any kind of a big fish trade this offseason, that Fred VanVleet team option gives them the flexibility to do something massive. without having to give up on either of Jalen Green or Alperen Sengun, if the organization is still fully bought in on both of those guys being the cornerstones moving forward. Now, the other option here is you can maybe finesse something with the combination of, Dillon Brooks and then Jock Landale gets you up to about 29, 30-ish. And then if you pick up the option for Aaron Holiday, that puts you up to about 35. And then, assuming you'd have to attach at least one young guy to a trade, right? Whether it's Jabari or possibly Reed Shepherd, that's another $10 to $12 million. That gets you up to maybe like 45-ish, somewhere like 45, 47-ish to push for a star player. But that's still short when you need potentially like KD's contract, right? $54 million. So if you're eyeballing a Kevin Durant trade and in some magical land, you want the Rockets to land Kevin Durant without having to give up either of Jalen Green or Alperen Sengun, it is pretty much unlikely unless the Rockets utilize that Fred VanVleet team option. So that is what it would mean if the Rockets pick up the team option. It gives them the flexibility to trade him as soon as this offseason in a potential big trade. It also, they wouldn't necessarily have to do it this offseason. Now, I will say a trade of that magnitude, a trade that is that big, is a lot harder to conduct midway through a season than it is to do in the offseason, because you can send out, 3, 4, 5 players for one guy in the offseason if necessary to make the money work and all that stuff. Mid-season trades are always a little bit more complicated because it has to be a 1-for-1 trade. So if you send out 3 or 4 guys to a team, they also have to send out 3 or 4 guys, which can make matching money a little bit difficult when you've got one guy making like $54 million. But it does preserve the Rockets' ability to potentially, just say, you know what, Fred, we want to pick up your option and we want to keep our options open to potentially, deal you this summer. And now I'm not sure that's what the negotiations would necessarily look like. Ultimately, the Rockets are in control. What they want to do sticks, right? If they want to pick up the option and keep their options open, they can do that. And then they can just tell Fred in their negotiations, they can just say, hey, we would rather revisit this next year, right? Maybe the Rockets don't want to be locked in to Fred VanVleet long-term. Maybe internally, they're very, very high on Reed Shepherd, and they want to see if Reed Shepherd could be ready to take the reins, maybe not this next season, but the following year, right? Year 3, Reed Shepherd might be ready to be a starting point guard. But if you're locked into Fred VanVleet long-term for a 3 or 4-year contract, then what are you going to ultimately do? Are you going to phase Fred VanVleet out and move him to the bench and then start Reed Shepherd over him in Reed Shepherd year 3? Who knows? So there are some options there where if the Rockets don't necessarily want to be fully locked into Fred VanVleet long-term, they could just pick up that option. But I think the main indicator here is if they pick up that team option, it is because they fully intend to trade him for a star level return or using his salary to match salaries in a star level return package. Otherwise, the more than likely outcome, now we can take our tinfoil hats off. The more than likely outcome is the Rockets decline his team option and renegotiate a new contract with Fred VanVleet. And we're going to talk about what that looks like here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by OpenPhone. Look, if you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait around? Probably not. You moved on. That's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets you manage business calls and texts from a single app. Their shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. And their AI agent handles after-hours calls, answers common questions, and captures leads so you never miss a chance to engage. OpenPhone is offering listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/lockedonnba. That's openphone.com, openphone.com/lockedonnba. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, now we get to the boring stuff. Not really the boring stuff. It's just that this is probably the most likely outcome for the Fred VanVleet situation. The Rockets really like Fred. Fred really likes being here in Houston. He's a really big part of this team. He's been a huge part of this turnaround. And Rockets fans should be eternally grateful for what Fred VanVleet has done to help turn this team around. Honestly, like, he's been a huge part of this phase of Rockets basketball and being competitive again. And he's a great vet to have for these young guys, right? And yes, he didn't have the best season shooting the basketball. His numbers certainly fell off the board. And that is something certainly to consider, right? And I'm sure the Rockets are going to point to those numbers in their contract negotiations and be like, Fred, what the hell, right? Like, your numbers were in the toilet for a big chunk of the season, but he's a proven vet. He can fit in a number of different schemes, whether you're playing him heavy on ball as the primary facilitator, or if you're playing him off ball, where you allow Jalen or Amin Thompson or Reed Shepherd to take on a bigger on ball role as the primary distributor and primary creator for the offense. He meshes incredibly well with Alperen and Sengun. They've got a great two-man game, and he's a very solid defender, right? He helps instill that kind of defensive culture and accountability that Fred VanVleet wants across the board, that has kept the Rockets at the top of the NBA pecking order as far as defense is concerned. So for all those reasons, right, it's very likely that Fred VanVleet returns, but this is what it would look like, right? Rockets would decline the team option, and then they would renegotiate a new deal with Fred VanVleet. Something, I would say, ballpark in the range of like $20 million a year seems like fair value for Fred VanVleet. First and foremost, he is not going to get anywhere north of 20, 25, whatever on the open market. Like, his agent can make all the phone calls in the world and try and figure out who might want to pay Fred. It's not happening. I don't see a team out there. I don't know of a team out there that A, he could go to and be a starting point guard. B, that would be able to pay him more than the Rockets could pay him, either by way of just picking up the option on his contract for $45 million, or by declining the option and agreeing to sign a new contract. And so I think it's more than likely we still see these two, Fred VanVleet and the Rockets partnered for the foreseeable future. And it's probably something like $20 million a year. My best guess would be 3 years would be ideal, right? I don't necessarily think you want to sign Fred to a 4-year contract. That seems a little steep. Maybe if you could do 3 years plus a team option on the final year, right? That would give you some club control. So like 4 years, like 80 million, something like that, where that final year is a team option. Although given the timeline and Fred being 31 years old right now, if he signs a 4-year deal and if that final year is a team option, then that puts his contract being over at age 35. I'm sure that he'd rather have the chance to sign one more, 3 or 4-year contract before, he kind of phases into that last leg of his NBA career. So a 3-year deal to me seems maybe more likely. And I saw Keith Smith from the Front Office Show suggesting a 3-year deal with like $45 million guaranteed on the contract. That seems appropriate given the fact that he would have had $45 million guaranteed if the Rockets picked up that team option. So by just flat out guaranteeing him $45 million anyways, he makes what he would have made over the shelf life of this current contract just stretched out over the next 3 years or so. And there has to be an understanding here that when the Rockets originally signed Fred VanVleet, they overpaid like hell to get him in Houston. Fred knows it. The Rockets know it. All 29 other teams in the association know it. Fred made bank on that contract. That is the most money Fred has ever made in his career, and it's the most money he will ever make in his career, being paid $40-some-odd million a year for his services to kind of come in and play cleanup with Ime Udoka and Dillon Brooks for the mess that the Rockets were before he got here. So Fred VanVleet is not a $40 million a year player. He's not. For what he gives you on the floor, for his production value, and for his importance to this Rockets team, he is definitely somewhere, though, in that $20 to $25 million a year range, something more akin to what Dillon Brooks is making contractually. So that's probably the most likely outcome. Rockets decline the option, renegotiate the new deal with Fred VanVleet, and he's likely still your starting point guard next season, unless, like we did with our put the tinfoil hats back on, unless the Rockets have some kind of miraculous trade lined up for a star player, and they need to use Fred's massive contract to be able to facilitate said trade. Now, I will go on to say that I don't know. I kind of think that it might be a mistake, right? Like, even if you were able to go get Kevin Durant, you'd have to be incredibly confident in the abilities of Jalen, Amin, Reed Shepherd, and I guess Aaron Holiday to be able to step up to the plate as the primary ball handlers and creators for this Rockets offense, and or be willing to lean much further into Alperen Sengun as the offensive hub for this team if you are going to move on from Fred VanVleet without replacing him with a tried and true lead guard or primary ball handler. That's the one risk that you run if you do move on from Fred VanVleet is, are these youngsters ready, right? Is Jalen ready to be a full-time primary ball handler? Is Amin Thompson ready for that responsibility? Is Reed Shepherd ready for that responsibility? I think a lot of the evidence probably points to no from this season. There was the stretch with Jalen and Amin without Fred VanVleet where things did look okay at times, but definitely not optimal. Maybe with a full offseason of work, things would look differently. Who knows? But as it currently stands, Fred is likely to be back. The Rockets don't want to lose him. He likes being in Houston. And he is really important for these young guys. He is. He provides kind of this calming influence on them, and hate him, love him for his shot selection at times. Fred has absolutely bailed out the Rockets time and time again. Fred has won the Rockets more games in the 2 years that he's been here in Houston than he's lost them games by shooting them out of games or missing shot or just struggling in general, right? Because he brings much more to the table than just scoring. He brings ball security. He brings playmaking. He brings defense. He brings the leadership, all of it across the board. So that's kind of where things stand with Fred VanVleet. I am very curious your thoughts. Are you looking forward to more Fred VanVleet next season? What would you like to see contract-wise for him? How would you like to see the Rockets handle his contract situation moving forward? Are you ready to be done with Fred VanVleet completely? Are you ready to just hand the reins over to Jalen Green, Amin Thompson, and Reed Shepherd? Or would you like to go to mystery box option number 3 and maybe the Rockets use their MLE to go out and sign a replacement level guard that maybe they could bring off the bench to help kind of ease the transition if they were to move on from Fred VanVleet, be it via trade or just letting him walk? Oh, that's the other option. They're not going to let Fred VanVleet walk in free agency. I should have used that as a disclaimer. They're either picking up the option and doing something with it, or they're declining the option and renegotiating a deal. There's no way that they just let Fred VanVleet walk. That is a gigantic, catastrophically missed opportunity. And you don't do that to the guy who's been your lead guard and, a big response, one of the biggest factors for the culture change over the last couple of years in Houston. That would be doing Fred VanVleet real dirty, is by just letting him walk in free agency and then he has to go sign with some Joe Blow team making MLE money or something. That'd be a tough pill to stomach. But so would trading him to the Phoenix Suns for Fred or for Kevin Durant. So I don't know which one would be worse if you were Fred VanVleet and you were looking at the possible outcomes here for how this thing plays out. No new contract. We're being sent to the desert for KD. I don't know. But give me your thoughts in the YouTube comments about the Fred VanVleet contract situation. Would love for you guys to weigh in. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.